Every town has its stories, but for Irene Taylor it all began with a shed and a letter she never expected. The kettle hissed faintly as steam curled upward and disappeared into the slanted beams of sunlight pouring through the lace-trimmed kitchen window. Irene moved carefully, her slippers making soft hushes against the worn hardwood floor. She cradled her favorite chipped mug, white with faded red poppies, and inhaled the mint tea's calming scent before stepping out onto the porch. The morning air held a crisp edge, tugging gently at the sleeves of her cardigan as she sat down in the wicker rocker, the creak beneath her a familiar, comforting groan. Hazel, her aging gray tabby, followed her out with regal indifference, then settled into the patch of sun that warmed the porch boards. Across the street, sprinklers ticked rhythmically on emerald lawns, flags fluttered on porches. Everything looked just the same, and that's how Irene liked it. Familiar, predictable. She took a sip, then another. The peace was a balm. Until her eyes landed on the bright yellow slip fluttering on her front door. It was pinned with a strip of painter's tape slightly skewed. Irene frowned, set her mug down on the rail, and walked over. Hazel's ears twitched, but she didn't move. The envelope crackled as she peeled it free. Printed in bold sans serif was the seal of the Wisteria Hollow Homeowners Association. Her breath caught. She opened it, unfolding the trifolded sheet with deliberate care. Violation notice, structure deemed non-compliant. Reason, visual incongruity / neighborhood uniformity standards. Subject, backyard shed. Dated appearance, untreated wood, misaligned roofing. Action required, full removal or architectural replacement. Edgeline, November 23rd. Non-compliance fee $150, 0 cents / day beginning October 31st. Her fingers stiffened. The shed. She didn't need to look at. She knew every nail in that building. It had stood behind the house since 1972, when Robert came home and needed something to do with his hands. He'd drawn the plans himself, measured everything twice, and built it in 3 weeks with salvaged wood from an old chapel 2 counties over. They'd painted it red at first, but over time it faded to a gentle gray. Robert never cared. It matches the sky better, he used to say. Inside were his tools, his journals, the ham radio he'd rigged to reach Canada. There were shelves of cassette tapes, flyers from town fairs, and an entire drawer filled with letters from fellow veterans. It was never just a shed. She folded the notice neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and walked inside. By mid-morning she was in the garden, clipping the last of her fall mums. The blooms were rust-colored now, fragile, but they still held fragrance. She worked slowly, focused, hoping the day would pass quietly, but quiet wasn't on the schedule. Any morning. She straightened and turned. Marla Dunbridge stood at the gate, dressed in a pale mauve pantsuit with a scarf that matched her lipstick too precisely. A clipboard rested against her hip like a badge. "Marla," Irene said evenly. "I was just passing through and noticed the envelope. I hope it didn't catch you off guard. These things, you know, come from the board, not me personally." She smiled with only her mouth. "I read it," Iria replied, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I figured. We've had a few complaints. Some neighbors feel the shed didn't quite align with the aesthetic guidelines." Marla gestured vaguely at the matching beige houses along the cul-de-sac. Irene looked toward the shed. Its roof sloped gently like it was bowing to the past. The vines along the fence had started turning burgundy. "It's been there longer than any of those houses," she said. Marla tilted her head sympathetically. "Of course. But neighborhoods evolve. Standards tighten. You know how it is." "I suppose I don't," Irene said quietly. Marla's smile thinned. "Look, I'll level with you. The board's already voted. You can either update it, new siding, maybe a fresh coat of white, or take it down. If you act before Thanksgiving, we can waive the fines." Irene met her eyes. "You're suggesting I erase what's left of my husband to keep a few fences happy?" "I'm suggesting we all make compromises," Marla replied. Her tone clipped. She opened the gate, took 2 steps up the walk, then paused. "Just think it over, okay? The holiday season's almost here. Wouldn't want to sour the neighborhood." She turned and walked back to her silver SUV, heels clicking on the pavement like an afterthought. That evening the house was silent, save for the low hum of the radio. Irene sat alone in the shed. The scent of cedar and old paper filled the air. Hazel curled up by the door, tail twitching in sleep. She reached into the drawer beneath Robert's workbench and found a faded envelope marked in his familiar hand, 1973, Kanoi letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid out the pages. The handwriting was looser then, urgent. He'd written about the men he'd met, the ones he couldn't save, the need to build something when he came home. "Wood and nails can't bring back what we lost," he wrote, "but they can keep me from losing more." The radio crackled, catching a piano waltz. The shed creaked around her, steady and unchanged. She folded the letter gently, as if it were made of glass, and placed it back in its place. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves like whispered warnings. Marla leaves a warning. Fines will begin tomorrow at $150.00/day for non-compliance. The next morning, Micah appears at the front gate. "Grandma, why is there a warning sign on your fence?" What Marla called an eyesore, Micah was about to discover as a time capsule. The rake made a rhythmic whispering sound as Micah swept leaves from the walkway. His flannel shirt sleeves rolled just below the elbows, revealing pale wrists marked with graphite smudges. Irene stood nearby with a canvas bag, gathering brittle mums, her garden gloves spotted with soil and thyme. It was early afternoon, and the sun streamed through the thinning branches of the old maple tree in the corner of the yard. "I didn't realize this many leaves could fall in one night," Micah said, nudging a stubborn pile toward the curb. Irene smiled faintly. "They determined I'll give them that." Hazel sat on the porch railing, tail flicking, watching the operation with sleepy disapproval. Micah paused and leaned on the rake. "Can I ask you something?" Irene glanced over. "Of course." "That shed," he said, nodding toward the weathered structure tucked behind the vegetable beds. "What's inside?" There was a pause, the kind that carried weight. "Robert's life," she said softly, "or pieces of it." Micah wiped his palms on his jeans. "Would you show me?" They crossed the lawn together. Irene paused at the door, then opened it with a quiet creak. Dust motes danced in golden shafts of sunlight pouring through the warped panels. The scent of cedar and old oil lingered like a memory. The space was tighter than it seemed from the outside. Tools lined the walls in careful rows, their outlines faintly marked on the wood behind them. A narrow workbench stood under a small window, its surface worn smooth from years of use. There were jars of bolts, a soldering iron, a typewriter half disassembled, and on the far shelf a wooden box labeled in Robert's handwriting, "Radio tubes, good." Micah walked in slowly, as though he'd entered a museum. He trailed a hand across the typewriter keys. "Used to fix those," Irene said. "Radios, too. He liked the ones with dials. Said it felt like tuning the world by hand." Micah crouched and pulled gently at an old canvas tarp tucked under the workbench. A puff of dust rose, and beneath it an old trunk revealed itself. Its corners were scuffed, the leather handle worn. "Can I?" he asked. She nodded. He undid the latches and opened it. Inside lay manila folders, rolled-up posters, envelopes bound with twine. One folder was labeled Wisteria Watch, 1974. Beneath that, the cassette in a plastic case bore the words Square Rally, November 74, written in faded marker. "Whoa," Michael murmured. He lifted a stack of Polaroids. Young men gathered in front of the courthouse steps, others holding signs with slogans that had yellowed with age. Irene reached for one and smiled wistfully. "That was Eddie," she said, tapping a figure in the back. "He used to bring Robert canned peaches after meetings." Micah looked up. "Wisteria Watch? This was local?" She nodded. "Started with a few veterans. They wanted to keep kids out of the draft line, wrote newsletters, handed out pamphlets. We used the shed as a press room, more or less." Micah turned the cassette over in his hand. "Do you have a player?" "I think the one in the kitchen still works, if the rewind button doesn't stick." They brought the tape inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and citrus, a simmering potpourri on the back burner. The table was set for two. Checkered cloth, mismatched teacups. Hazel had already claimed a seat on one of the chairs. Micah pushed the cassette into the player. The motor buzzed, clicked, then silence. A voice crackled to life. We stood there, not shouting, not moving, just holding signs, and for a moment even the mayor looked unsure of what to say. That moment we all felt it. We had a right to be heard. Robert's voice was softer than Micah expected, gentle but clear. Irene closed her eyes for a breath. They ate quietly after that. Vegetable soup, buttered toast, and slices of apple with cinnamon. Micah chewed thoughtfully, then pulled out his laptop. "I want to look this up," he said. "Wisteria Watch sounds like something a university archive might have kept." She nodded and sipped her tea. After a few minutes, he turned the screen toward her. It's here, just a blurb, but it's listed under Local Civil Organizing 1970S. Says it operated out of Wisteria Hollow between 1973 and 1975. Irene's lips curved upward, barely. That's when the phone rang. She answered and listened silently. When she hung up, her expression had shifted. I just raised the fine, $300 a day now, and they copied the entire board. Mika exhaled through his nose. They're really pushing. He stood and started pacing, his flannel rustling against his jeans. Then he stopped. Grandma, maybe the second chest is shed. She looked at him, one brow raised. He held up the cassette, the photos, the flyers. This is history. She didn't answer at first. She reached for the cassette still sitting beside the player, turned it over slowly. Then we'd better start telling the right story. If they were going to fight Marla, they needed something stronger than anger. They needed a designation. Maple and Mug was one of those places that looked like it had always been there. The bell above the door jingled softly as Irene and Micah stepped inside, the warm scent of cinnamon coffee and pecan pie wrapping around them like an old quilt. The brick walls were lined with framed photos of county fairs and high school marching bands, and every table had a mason jar filled with seasonal flowers. Mom's this month, fading but cheerful. Kathy was behind the counter, wiping down a tray with a cloth and humming something old and sweet. Her gray-streaked hair was tucked into a bun, and her apron read, "Powered by Pie." She looked up, smiled. "Afternoon, Irene, Micah. Haven't seen you two in a bit." "We need caffeine," Micah said with a grin. "And advice," Irene added, her voice softer. Kathy raised an eyebrow but nodded toward the back. "Booth by the heater's yours." They slid into the worn leather seats, and not 2 minutes later Kathy brought over a pot of coffee, 2 mugs, and thick slices of pumpkin loaf, still warm. Irene shifted in her seat, smoothing her scarf, then reached into her tote and pulled out a manila folder. "Micah thinks this might matter," she said, opening it slowly. Kathy took one look and waved toward the front. "Hold that thought." She stepped around the counter and knocked twice on the door to the small office beside the kitchen. "Ellis, you've got a visitor." The man who emerged was wiry and sharp-eyed, with a cardigan slung over one shoulder and a rolled-up newspaper in his hand. "I always have visitors when Kathy's pushing pie," he muttered. Kathy smirked. "Be nice, this one's history." Mr. Ellis eased into the seat across from Irene and adjusted his glasses. "Let's see it." She laid out the papers, photos, handwritten flyers, the cassette. Micah added a few scans from his laptop, including one labeled Wisteria Watch Square Rally 1974. Ellis barely blinked before saying, "I haven't heard that name in 40 years. "You remember it?" Irene asked. "I helped shut it down," he paused, seeing her reaction. "Not because I wanted to. Because the school board made me. I taught government then. Kids were printing handouts faster than we could collect them." He leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Wisteria Watch had a voice. Looks like it still does." Michael leaned in. "Is it enough to stop the HOA?" Ellis scratched his chin. "Maybe. There's a clause in the city's zoning code. If a structure's part of a recognized cultural history, HOA designations can't override its preservation. But you'd need a formal application, documentation, a strong case." "We have most of that," Irene said, though her voice quivered slightly. Kathy, who'd been pretending to clean nearby, turned back toward them. "You need people too. Attention. I could share this on the cafe page. Folks love a fight that feels personal." Irene hesitated. "It feels strange, airing it like this." "It's not airing laundry," Kathy said gently. "It's protecting memory." That evening, back at the house, the dining table disappeared beneath folders and photos. Irene moved carefully, wearing old gloves that still smelled faintly of lemon oil. Micah scanned each item on his portable rig, labeling files meticulously. The cassette player sat on the sideboard, occasionally clicking as they rewound and replayed segments of Robert's old recordings. Hazel napped beneath the table, unfazed. They worked in companionable silence until the doorbell rang. Irene opened the door to find an envelope taped to it, this one in bold red font. "Notice final warning. Subject, unauthorized structure. Deadline, December 1st. Failure to comply will result in enforcement intervention. No signature, just the HOA seal and Marla's name at the bottom in printed type." Micah looked up from the table, concern in his eyes. "Community enforcement?" he echoed. "What does that even mean?" "Probably a polite way of saying bulldozer," Irene muttered. She returned to the table and reached for another stack. At the bottom was a flyer, yellowed and creased. Across the top, Veterans for Peace, Rally, 1974, Courthouse Square. She held it up. Micah leaned in, then zoomed in on the scanned image. In the background, beyond the cluster of men holding signs, stood a familiar, sloped roof. "That's this house," he said. "Look, same trellis, same fence line." "And the shed," Arabia whispered. "Right there." Micah grinned. "We've got location, date, visual proof." Irene's fingers brushed the paper. "They stood here. It wasn't just a place. It was the start." She stared at the flyer, voice low and certain. "It started right here. Maybe it should stay right here." The clouds gathered early, but it wasn't the weather that worried Irene. It was the HOA inspector standing at her gate, who wore a navy windbreaker with the HOA's silver crest stitched just above the chest pocket. His cap sat low, shielding his eyes from the rain that drizzled steadily from the gray sky. He didn't speak, just nodded toward the shed, then back to the clipboard in his hand. Irene stood in the doorway in her wool sweater, arms crossed tightly. Her breath rose in faint plumes. Behind her, the kettle began to whine on the stove. "Good morning," she said, the words taut. The inspector gave her a paper, laminated, dry under plastic. It stated that a routine compliance check was being conducted on properties flagged for unresolved violations. Beneath the print was a space for her signature, authorizing entry. She handed it back. "This is private property, and you're not coming in." He didn't argue, just clicked his pen and made a note, then stepped back as Marla approached from behind the hedge. "Irene," Marla said, her umbrella cocked at a stiff angle, "this could have gone smoothly." "It still can," Irene replied, "if you leave." Marla smiled thinly. "We're well within our rights to assess safety conditions. Rotting wood, potential pest harboring, environmental concerns." Irene stepped forward, letting the rain darken the toes of her slippers. "Unless you have a warrant or a city order, you're trespassing." The inspector looked toward Marla, uncertain. Marla's jaw tightened. "You're escalating this." "No, Mara," Irene said. "You are." She shut the door gently but firmly. Inside, Hazel darted under the couch at the sound of the closing door. Irene exhaled through her nose, walked into the kitchen, and turned off the kettle, which had started to shriek. The whistle ceased, leaving only the sound of rain tapping the window panes. Michael arrived shortly after lunch, carrying a bag of takeout and a laptop under one arm. "They came again?" he asked, setting down boxes of soup and cornbread. "Brought someone with a badge and silence," Irene said. She tried to pour tea, but her hand slipped, and the teacup cracked against the saucer's edge. It didn't shatter, but a long hairline fracture split down the porcelain like a warning. Micah winced. "I'll glue it later." They ate in the living room, where the floor was now half covered with stacks of folders and newspaper clippings. Irene sipped carefully from a second cup. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Micah opened his laptop. "I've been posting pieces of what we found, some of the flyers, a few snippets of Robert's recordings. There's this local archive board I joined, mostly grad students and history nerds. They're reading it up." He turned the screen toward her. The thread, titled "Community Sheds as Sites of Activism," had dozens of comments. Kathy had shared one of the scanned 1974 photos on her cafe page. The caption read, "Is this what we're calling an eyesore now?" The post had already been shared 117 times. A few of the comments made Irene smile. "My dad used to volunteer at that shed. I remember Robert handing out lemonade during the power outage in '78. Tell the HOA to go iron their khakis." But one comment stood out. "This structure has cultural value. If needed, I can verify documents for an academic record. Dr. A. Kendall, State University Archives." Micah clicked the name. The profile seemed legitimate. "Looks like someone serious. He's in Tennessee. Works with local history preservation. I'll message him." As evening fell, the rain continued, heavier now. Irene lit 2 lamps, one in the hallway, one by the front door. She left the porch light on longer than usual. They worked until nearly 8. Irene sorted through a folder of Robert's writing, reading quietly under her breath. Micah uploaded another batch of scans, labeling them meticulously. When he stepped outside to get something from the car, he froze. "Grandma," he called gently, "you might want to see this." There, on the porch rail, sat a small envelope. No name, no stamp, just folded paper wrapped with a red string. Irene opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence written in sharp, slanted hand. "Don't let them erase what matters." She turned the paper over. Nothing else. Micah read it, then looked around. The street was empty. The next morning, Irene pulled back the curtain and saw Marla at the gate again, this time with 2 men, both in HOA windbreakers, standing just behind her. The clipboard in Marla's hand might as well have been a sword, and Irene had no intention of surrendering. The storm had passed, leaving the world slick and shining. Irene stood at the edge of her porch, her boots damp from the wet boards, watching as Marla advanced with purpose down the walkway, flanked by 2 HOA officers whose windbreakers still glistened with the morning dew. The sun was climbing steadily, casting long shadows across the street. The leaves stuck to the sidewalk in orange and yellow patches like forgotten decoration. "Good morning, Irene," Marla said crisply, stopping just short of the first step. "We're here under the emergency resolution passed last night." Irene folded her arms. "Is that so?" Marla lifted the clipboard, flipping to the first page. Section 8A, subsection F. Authority to act on structures deemed unsafe or damaging to neighborhood value. 30 days notice. After that, enforcement is automatic. "Automatic," Irene repeated. "That's a new one." Marla's lips pressed into a flat line. "I'm sure you're aware your non-compliance places the HOA in a difficult position." Behind her, one officer glanced up toward the shed, the other adjusted his badge. Neither spoke. Irene reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a slip of paper. "This is still private property," she said, unfolding it slowly, "and unless you're carrying a court order, I'll have to ask you all to leave." Marla exhaled. "We're trying to be civil, Irene." "Then be civil somewhere else." There was a moment of hesitation. The older of the 2 officers looked toward Marla for direction. She gave a short nod, and the 3 turned back toward the sidewalk without another word. Only when the gate clicked shut did Irene's shoulders sag. Inside, the quiet was immense. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she reached for the tea kettle. The crack in her favorite cup had widened. She set it down and pressed her palms flat against the table. Micah walked in, stopping short when he saw her. "They came again?" She nodded, not looking up. 30 days, they said. Then they'll do it themselves. Micah dropped his backpack by the door and knelt beside her. "We're not going to let them." She didn't speak for a while, then, quietly, "Robert built that shed with his own hands. It held him together after the war. And now they want to call it garbage." He took her hand. "It's not garbage, and they don't get to erase it." That afternoon, a familiar knock came at the door. 2 sharp raps, then a third like punctuation. Mr. Ellis stepped in without waiting for an invitation, his arms full of old folders and a rolled-up printout. "I brought something," he said, easing into a kitchen chair with a grunt. "You'll want to see this." He spread out a photocopy of what looked like an ancient HOA bylaws document, yellowed and brittle at the edges. "Here," he said, tapping a section with a bony finger. "Clause 12C. This version's from 1981, the earliest one still legally referenced. It clearly states that any structure built before 1970 and maintained in original form is exempt from subsequent architectural reviews." Irene Meander leaned in. "You're certain?" "As certain as a civics teacher with bad knees can be." He smiled. "Check your deed." They dug through her cabinet files until they found the Teller R&I dated August 1968. Michael let out a low whistle. "That's 2 years before the cutoff." Ellis nodded, satisfied. "You've got your exemption." They sat back for a moment, letting the relief settle in. The kettle hissed again on the stove. Micah opened his laptop. "We should post this." "But," Ellis held up a hand. "Not yet. Let her make the next move. You post now, she'll spin it as defiance. Wait until she doubles down. Then hit her with it." Kathy called an hour later. "You want me to start hinting?" she asked. "Soft posts? Something cryptic?" "Not yet," Irene said. "Soon." That evening, with trembling hands steadied by resolve, Irene typed out the clause in a large, bold font, laminated the page, and taped it beside the existing HOA notice on her front gate. The words shone under the porch light like armor. Before bed, she stood by the shed for a long moment, the air damp and cool. Hazel padded past her ankles and disappeared into the grass. She checked her answering machine before turning in. A new voicemail blinked. "Mrs. Taylor, this is Dr. Caleb Monroe from the Tennessee Historical Survey Office. I think we need to talk." He arrived in a beat-up pickup truck with a clipboard and soft-spoken voice, but his words would change everything. The truck rumbled up Irene's gravel drive just after 9, its wheels crunching the last of the frost-dusted leaves. A light snow had started falling, soft, tentative flurries that settled gently on the railings and the slope of the shed roof. Irene stood waiting on the porch, mittens wrapped around a thermos of tea, Hazel curled up at her feet like a guardian. Dr. Caleb Monroe stepped out of the driver's side wearing a wool overcoat and a knitted hat that had lost its elasticity at the edges. His glasses fogged briefly as he greeted her with a gentle smile and extended his hand. "Monsieur Taylor?" he asked. "Ayin," she said, returning the handshake. "Thank you for making the trip." He glanced toward the backyard where the shed stood quietly beneath the lacework of snow-covered tree limbs. "Looks exactly like I hoped it would." Micah came out a moment later, laptop under his arm, and offered Dr. Monroe a printed folder of documents, scans, photos, transcriptions. They walked to the shed together, boots leaving soft indentations in the thin layer of snow. Irene unlocked the door and stepped aside as Monroe entered. The interior was warmer than expected. Micah had plugged in a space heater earlier that morning. A faint hum filled the room, the scent of cedar, old paper, and something sweeter, cinnamon scones, still warm in a foil-covered tin, drifted in from the corner table. Monroe moved slowly, reverently. He touched nothing at first, only looked. His fingers hovered over Robert's workbench, the organized rows of tools, the framed protest flyer from 1974, yellowed but carefully preserved behind glass. "This is," he paused, adjusting his glasses, "more curated than most county archives I've seen." Irene smiled faintly. Robert liked order. He believed that if you didn't care for the details, you didn't really care for the truth. Micah powered up the small cassette deck sitting on a shelf. The tape clicked into place with a soft rattle. Static, then Robert's voice cracked slightly by time, but firm. "I came home different," the voice said. "The world had moved on, but the shed was still mine to shape. I built it with lumber from a chapel, wired it myself. It was never about the tools. It was about space, about silence you could hear yourself in." Monroe's eyes softened. He didn't interrupt. The tape continued. "I kept records, kept stories. I needed to know that what I saw didn't vanish when the door closed. This place held my hand steady." When the tape stopped, silence followed like a benediction. Monroe exhaled slowly. "Do you know how rare this is?" Irene glanced down. "It's just ours." "That's exactly what makes it matter," he said. "Places like this don't get built with blueprints. They're built with memory." He took out a small camera and began snapping quiet photographs of the workbench, the flyers, even Hazel, dozing on a folded quilt by the heater. Micah offered him a scone. "Kathy made them," he said. "Said she was on moral support duty." Monroe took a bite, nodded approvingly. "Tell her I've been bribed with worse." They stood together for a while, watching snow dust the window. Irene pointed to a spot on the wall where Robert had once tacked up a list of radio frequencies. "He used to talk to a man in Alberta every Thursday. They exchanged apple pie recipes once." Monroe chuckled softly. That's preservation of culture right there." As they stepped back outside, the air sharper now, Monroe closed his notepad and slipped it into his coat. "I'll be honest," he said. "Your documentation's already better than half the applications we get. This isn't a fight over zoning. This is about preserving a voice." Irene blinked quickly and looked away toward the trees. "Then we have a chance?" "You have more than that," he said. "You have a story that deserves to stay standing." Kathy arrived just as he was pulling away, carrying 2 thermoses and a box of muffins. "I brought reinforcements," she said, holding up the box. "They're cranberry this time. I'm branching out." Micah set up mugs on the porch rail. They stood sipping cider, watching snowflakes spin in lazy spirals. The yard glowed softly, and for the first time in weeks, Irene felt her breath come easier. That night, as she stepped onto the porch to bring in the thermos, something sharp caught her eye. Her breath hitched. Across the white picket fence, someone had scrawled in red spray paint, "Slanted and aggressive. Not for here ever." The room was packed, the folding chairs squeaked, and the past was about to take the floor. The Wisteria Hollow Town Hall hadn't seen this many people since the blizzard of '91. Neighbors filled every chair, with some lining the back walls, clutching thermoses of cider and hot coffee. Christmas garlands hung unevenly from the ceiling, their fake pine needles glittering beneath humming fluorescent lights. Somewhere near the podium, someone had brought a tray of molasses cookies and forgotten napkins. Irene sat near the front, her hands folded in her lap, the shed's laminated photos and documents neatly clipped inside a manila folder beside her. Micah sat to her right, earbuds slung over his shoulder like a stethoscope, the cassette player nestled in a canvas bag. On her other side, Mr. Ellis leaned forward with quiet intent, while Kathy patted Irene's hand whenever her fingers tensed. Marla entered just before the meeting began. Her heels echoed on the linoleum floor. She wore a sharp navy suit and held a slim folio under her arm. Her smile was brittle but practiced. Mayor Loring, a soft-spoken man with spectacles and a patchy gray mustache, called the meeting to order. Tonight's topic concerns the application for cultural designation status for a structure at 129 Meadow Bend Road, what's commonly referred to as the Taylor Shed. A few murmurs rose. The mayor tapped his gavel gently. Per town charter, both sides may speak before a community vote is held. We'll begin with Mrs. Dunbridge. Murray walked to the front, paper in hand. I want to be clear, she began. This isn't personal. We all respect Irene Taylor's contributions to this town, but we must recognize when sentiment begins to interfere with standards. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. What stands behind the Taylor house is not a museum. It's a dilapidated structure, unpainted, unsealed, non-compliant with our neighborhood guidelines. If we allow this exception, we invite decay into every block. What happens when someone else wants to protect a rusted swing set or a broken-down carport? A few nods, a few crossed arms. Irene is using nostalgia as a shield, Merle continued, but neighborhoods must move forward, not backward. She stepped down without further comment. Harry rose slowly. Her knees ached, but she didn't ask for help. She walked to the lectern, placed her palms on either side, and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. Many grayer, some unchanged, all watching. I'm not here to defend rust or wood, she said, voice steady though her hands trembled. I'm here for what the shed holds. My husband Robert built it with chapel lumber and worn hands. He used it to reach the world again when he couldn't find his footing after the war. She paused, her breath shallow. It was where he taught kids how to solder, where he ran Wisteria Watch with Ellis and half the folks in this room. It's where I still find him, sometimes, in the smell of cedar or the weight of a screwdriver in my hand. Micah stood quietly, walked to the cassette deck set on the nearby table. He pressed play. A moment of static, then Robert's voice, tinny but clear. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest truths. You don't need a marble arch to remember who you were. You just need a roof that kept you dry and the silence to hear yourself come home. The room stilled. Even the heater clicked off as if to listen. Dr. Monroe stood next. He didn't bring papers, just his voice. I've toured county courthouses and folk museums across Tennessee, and I'll tell you now, what I saw in that shed was as honest as any archive. The city board agrees. The application is pending final review, and every sign points to approval. He looked toward Irene. This isn't about resisting change. It's about remembering why we changed in the first place. Then one by one, townspeople stood. Mr. Ellis cleared his throat. We printed handbills in that shed, called it the Freedom Press, though the ink always smudged. Laughter broke the tension. Kathy followed. Robert let me use the back wall for storage when I started the cafe. Didn't charge a penny. Brought me a pie on opening day, burnt crust and all. Others spoke. Mr. Langley from the bakery, Miss Sue from the library, even a boy no older than 10 who said he liked a cat that lived there. Finally, the mayor returned to the podium. We'll now vote by ballot. You'll find paper slips under your seats. The room rustled as pens scratched. The slips were folded and passed forward. Minutes ticked by. By count, the mayor said, adjusting his glasses, we have 48 votes in favor and 3 against. A low hum of applause spread, building into cheers. Irene felt someone press a folded paper into her hand. It was the certificate, signed, sealed. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. Marla stood frozen, her arms stiff at her sides. She turned without a word, heels snapping against the floor as she exited, her silhouette shrinking through the glass doors. Later, at home, the house quiet once more, Irina stepped out onto the porch to breathe the cold night air. A dusting of frost lined the railing. Hazel sat curled on the doormat, watching the street. That's when she saw the envelope. Just a simple piece of cream stationery tucked between the slats. No stamp, no return address. She opened it with care. Inside, in a hand she hadn't seen in years, were 5 words. You did good. The ribbon was red, the scissors gleamed, and the shed stood tall in the golden winter sun. December 15th dawned bright and hushed. A thin crust of snow dusted the grass and sparkled like sugar on every branch. Irene stood in the backyard, her breath fogging as she watched folding chairs being lined up on the lawn. Kids zipped past, their boots crunching in the snow as they chased each other around picnic tables loaded with potluck dishes. casseroles in glass pans, pies with crimped crusts, and Kathy's famous cranberry bars that had their own section and label. The shed had never looked prouder. Cleaned and gently restored, its faded boards were now framed by simple pine garlands. A wooden plaque hung above the doorway, hand-painted in cream and green, Wisteria Hollow Historical Archive. Irene smoothed the front of her coat and adjusted her scarf. Micah stood at the makeshift podium wearing a wool cap and holding a single index card. He cleared his throat as people began to settle. "This story," he began, voice soft but sure, "started with a letter and a shed, but really, it started with people who stood even when told to sit down." The crowd grew quiet. Only the wind rustled through the pine needles. To those who kept notes, who asked questions, who made space for memory, "This is for you." He stepped back and Irene approached slowly. In her gloved hands were a pair of silver scissors, ornate and old, the same ones she had used to cut the cake at her wedding. She took a deep breath, looked at Micah, then at the crowd, and cut the ribbon. Cheers erupted. Kathy clapped so hard she nearly spilled her cider. Mr. Ellis dabbed his eyes and muttered something about wind. Dr. Monroe stood near the back, smiling with quiet satisfaction. One by one, townspeople entered the shed. Inside, everything had been labeled. The old typewriter, Robert's workbench, flyers from the rallies, even Hazel's worn cushion beneath the heater, though Hazel herself had reclaimed it with dignified annoyance. The far wall displayed photographs. Irene and Robert at protests, kids soldering radio kits, community meals from the 1980s. A small speaker played a loop of Robert's recordings, his voice faint but clear. "Places hold truth, if you let them." Near the doorway, Kathy pulled back a curtain to reveal a framed newspaper article. Eyesore no more, the town that fought back. Outside, people gathered near the cider table. Children built lopsided snowmen, while elders swapped stories about the town's lean years. Music played faintly from an old record player, the kind with a gentle hiss between songs. Someone strummed a guitar. Irene sat on a wooden bench just beyond the crowd, her coat bundled around her shoulders, hands folded neatly in her lap. Micah joined her, offering her a thermos of cider. She took a slow sip, eyes on the shed. "I'd have loved this," she said quietly. "I think he does," Michael replied. After a moment, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Old, wooden, smooth at the corners. She handed it to Micah. "Robert's cassettes," she said. "Keep them safe, or maybe add to it someday." Micah accepted the box as if it were something sacred. As the afternoon waned and the light shifted to amber, Ariane stood once more and faced the group, conversations hushed. She didn't need the podium. "This place belonged to Robert," she said, her voice carrying in the still air, "but now it belongs to all of you." Applause rose again, not loud but sincere. Later, as the crowd began to thin and people gathered their dishes and folded their scarves, Irene lingered near the gate. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, light, almost shy. She turned to look at the plaque once more. Beneath it, nailed gently into the post, was a new sign. Small, carved by hand, its letters burned dark into the wood. Since 2023. On a quiet winter afternoon beneath ribbons and memories, a modest shed once called an eyesore became a symbol of something much greater. It wasn't just about old boards and forgotten flyers. It was about one woman's courage, a town's awakening, and the quiet strength of legacy. Sometimes it takes a single voice to remind others what matters. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble. So if you've ever stood alone on your porch, wondering if your story still has weight, remember Irene Taylor's shed. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to dust off your own.